At 6:11 a.m., July 27, 1945, a tractor sat motionless in a vast Texas wheat field, its steel silhouette dark against the rising sun. The war in Europe was over, but for one farmer in central Texas, another battle had begun. His enemy wasn't armed. It didn't march or fire back. It was a silent engine, one that refused to breathe. The farmer was Thomas Reed, 47 years old. His face carried the weight of 6 years of drought, rationing, and the anxious waiting for letters from two sons scattered across distant battlefields. That morning, his John Deere Model B, the machine standing between survival and ruin, would not start. The wheat around him trembled in the breeze, only 2 days away from over-ripening. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, rolling forward like a second front. If Reed lost this harvest, he would lose the farm. There would be no second chance. Working beside him stood 12 men in faded khaki, their uniforms marked with two stark black letters, PW, prisoner of war. They were Germans, captured in Tunisia, shipped across the Atlantic, processed through camps in Oklahoma, and finally delivered to Texas to replace American laborers now fighting overseas. Behind them, a lone guard leaned on his rifle, already sweating under the morning heat. The prisoners spoke little. They had learned that silence, here, meant safety. One of them kneeled by the tractor's wheel hub. Karl Weber, 27 years old, slight, observant. Before the war, he had worked in a Daimler factory in Stuttgart, building aircraft engines for the Luftwaffe. His hands still moved with the memory of machinery, precision, balance, rhythm. Now those same hands hauled grain beneath the Texas sun. Reed slammed the tractor's hood closed, muttering a curse that needed no translation. The guard smirked. Karl hesitated, then stepped forward. "Sir, I can fix," he said, carefully shaping the English words through a thick German accent. Reed looked up, half irritated, half amused. "You? You can fix this?" Karl nodded once. "Engines are same anywhere." Reed studied him, the thin frame, the calm eyes that had seen cities burn, and finally stepped aside. "Fine, but if you break it worse, you'll be pulling that plough yourself." Karl only smiled faintly and began. In 1945, the United States held over 400,000 German POWs. Nearly 50,000 lived in Texas alone. Their camps stretched across the countryside, from Hearne to Hereford, from Camp Bowie near Brownwood to small branch outposts hidden behind cotton fields. Under the Geneva Convention, they received decent food, medical care, and even 80 cents a day in pay. Locals didn't know what to make of them at first. Some saw enemies, others saw free labour. But over time, suspicion slowly gave way to curiosity. Many of these men had been bakers, teachers, mechanics, soldiers only because the war demanded it. By the summer of 1945, these POWs had harvested over 1 million acres of crops that would otherwise have rotted in the Texas heat. And in the middle of that sea of wheat stood Thomas Reed's small farm, and the silent tractor threatening to destroy it. Karl lifted the hood again. The air smelled of gasoline, dust, and sun-baked earth. He traced the ignition wire, cracked, the magneto coil, fractured. No spare parts, no nearby store, no time. "Need wire," Karl said. "Metal wire," Reed frowned. "For what?" Karl pointed toward the barbed wire fence line. "That will do," the guard laughed. "He wants to fix a tractor with barbed wire," but Reed raised a hand. "Let him try." Karl borrowed a pair of pliers, stripped the insulation from the damaged wire, and cut a short length of fencing wire. He wrapped it around the broken coil, twisting it tight until it hummed like a drawn string. Then he pulled a nail from the barn wall, ground its edge against a stone step, and slid it into place as a makeshift contact point. His movements were deliberate, almost delicate, the patience of a watchmaker threading springs. Sweat ran down his neck, soaking through the worn cloth of his POW uniform. At 6:47 a.m., he stepped back. "Try now." Reed pulled the crank. Once. Nothing. Twice. A cough. A burst of black smoke. A third pull. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. For 3 seconds, no one moved. Then the guard shouted. The prisoners cheered. And Reed stared, speechless, as the machine that had defied him for 2 desperate days now idled smoothly, held together by scrap metal and the hands of a man the world had labelled his enemy. That evening, Reed did something no regulation book covered. He asked the guard if the men could eat at the house. The sergeant shrugged. "Your risk, sir." Inside the plain farmhouse, Mrs. Reed served cornbread, beans, and strong coffee. The Germans sat tensely, unsure if they were intruding or welcome. Karl watched the oil lamp flame like it was a rare and fragile thing. Conversation started slow. Then it found its rhythm. Reed spoke of the war's end, of his sons, one in France, one missing in the Philippines. Karl spoke softly of Stuttgart, of nights when sirens wailed and the city burned in waves of fire. At one point, Reed's young son brought a toy truck to the German mechanic. "Can you fix it?" Karl laughed, tightened the axle with a nail and sent it rolling across the table. For a moment, the room felt lighter, as though, outside, the thunder rolling across the plains couldn't quite reach them. Somewhere in that small Texas farmhouse, something fragile, something human, had been repaired too. The next morning, the old John Deere came to life on the very first pull, its engine firing with a confidence it hadn't shown in days. From sunrise to sunset, the men worked the fields with a quiet urgency, racing the storm building on the horizon. And when the rain finally broke, across the plains, the last wagon rolled under cover just in time. The wheat was safe. The season saved. Word travelled quickly through the POW camp. The German fixed the American's farm, they said. Guards joked about signing him on with the Army Corps of Engineers. The other prisoners teased him with a new nickname, Herr John Deere. 2 months later, orders arrived. The US Army was shipping prisoners home. On the roster for transport number 217, bound for New York, was Karl Weber. He spent his final hours on the Reed farm quietly repairing tools. Tools he knew he would never touch again. Reed drove out to meet him one last time. There were no speeches, no ceremony, only a handshake, firm and silent. Then Reed pressed a small photograph into Karl's hand. The Reed family, standing beside the tractor he had brought back to life. "If you ever make it back," Reed said softly, "there'll be work waiting." Karl looked down at the photograph for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me feel useful again." Karl's journey home lasted 31 days across the Atlantic. When the ship finally docked at Bremerhaven, the shoreline looked like the surface of another planet. Cities flattened, cranes frozen in silence, children picking through rubble for coal. Stuttgart greeted him with the same devastation. The Daimler factory where he once built engines was a blackened ruin. His parents' apartment was gone. Neighbours told him they had not survived the massive raid of March 1944. With nothing left, Karl rebuilt his life one small job at a time, repairing bicycles, then tractors brought in from the countryside. He eventually rented a workshop and painted his name above the door, Weber Maschinen and Service. On the wall he hung a single photograph, the Reeds, their tractor, and the endless Texas sky. When customers asked about it, he would only smile and say, "A friend who taught me how to fix things properly." In May 1947, a brown envelope reached the Reed farm. Inside was a letter written in careful, deliberate English. "Dear Mr. Reed, I hope the harvest was good this year. I am home. Germany's broken but alive. When I fix engines, I still hear Texas wind. Thank you for the day you trusted me. Karl Weber." Mrs. Reed framed the letter and set it on the mantel. The ink faded over the years, but the words never lost their weight. Time moved on. Camp Bowie was torn down, replaced by houses and sidewalks. Most people forgot that enemy soldiers had once worked those fields, walked those roads. But across Texas, in barns, in sheds, in aging workshops, tractors repaired by German hands still ran smoother than anyone expected. In 1984, a Dallas journalist researching POW camps tracked down Thomas Reed Jr., now an old man with a memory like a ledger. When asked about the story, Reed Jr. simply nodded and led him to the barn. Inside sat the same John Deere. Its paint faded, but the barbed wire repair still wrapped tightly around its heart. Reed Jr. pulled the crank. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. "Still works," he said, patting the hood. "Guess he fixed more than just metal that day." Across Texas, the legacy of those POWs lived on. Some returned after the war, married Americans, built new lives on unfamiliar soil. Karl Weber never did. He died in 1972, buried in Stuttgart. When his nephew cleaned out the workshop, he found the same photograph, still hanging above the bench where Karl had spent his last years repairing the broken pieces of a shattered country. On the back, written in German, were 5 words: Frieden beginnt mit Vertrauen. Peace begins with trust, and if you stand long enough in those quiet Texas fields, you can still hear the faint hum of that old engine, and the echo